correct answer to when did international relations begin depends on how each one of us interprets the concept of international relations. Focusing on international relations as we are acquainted in today's modern world, we would reply according to what is consistent with us, to what we know today, for instance, with the sovereign state. However, as it seems to us, the beginning of international relations doesn't need to be related with a modern state, but with the origins itself when the first attempts of interaction between international systems occurred. This is why we think that international relations began 5,000 years ago with the appearance of the first city-states, which were Sumerians. Sumerian city-states appeared as a form of international systems after many years of having first interaction attempts named pre-international systems. To our mind, it is sure that the genesis of international relations came into the ancient world at the moment that Sumerian first city-states fulfilled all types of interaction: political, economic, military, and cultural interactions.
What we consider as the first fully fledged international system goes back to the year 3500 before the Common Era, with the Sumerian city-states. The structure of the video will be divided into 4 different approaches. These approaches have led us to the understanding of Sumer as the first city-state civilization and therefore the birth of international relations. The Sumer civilization was capable of influencing the entire Middle East in many forms with their essential qualities.
Sumer was located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the southern part of Mesopotamia. This area would later become Babylonia and nowadays is the south region of Iraq, from Baghdad to the Persian Gulf. Sumerians were capable of turning this nowadays arid and unproductive territory into a completely livable and developed place. They came up with systems of irrigation, started a system of cuneiform writing on clay, and were capable of compiling laws. Because of the importance of the irrigation systems, which were vital for the survival of the Sumerian society, they needed to create some institution that could control and regulate these irrigation systems. It could not be the landowner, either the community, but they made a governmental institution. This brings us to the first point of why we relate the Sumerians to the start of international relations, the political approach.
The Sumerians were the first civilization to build a well-structured and functional government. The government was monarchical, and even though the king had much power, it was not an absolute monarchy. The population was divided between 12 city-states. Each of them was represented and led by a different king and with its army. Nevertheless, the interesting fact was that even though those city-states were different apart from each other, their inhabitants spoke the same language, prayed the same gods, and could move with complete freedom from one city-state to another. Furthermore, what is even more important is that the laws of those city-states were pretty much the same. They were universal. The Sumerians were, I quote, the first to compile laws and codes in order to avoid misunderstanding, misrepresentation, and arbitrariness. They created a small-scale international system. The political system was based on democracy, since these kings received advice from the General Assembly of men elected by the population. That said, we can appreciate the complexity of the Sumerians' political system and take into account that they were among the first civilizations to have democratic political system. As Warburton said in his book The Babylonian World, diplomatic influence of Mesopotamia in the ancient world's political system was based solely on developing familial relationships with other neighbors. The intention of creating a well-structured and organized government was to get efficient, effective, and organized workers. Thanks to this workforce, people could work better together and achieve better results. Thus, they built different routes through which commerce could pass. Since transport was essential for trade, they managed to facilitate the exchange of goods with other cities and neighboring towns. In addition to the importance of creating and improving transportation routes, the temples were a very relevant factor for the Sumerian economy. These spaces were not only for religious use, but were also in charge of a large number of lands and counted with numerous workshops and warehouses within the building. As a result, temples provided a large number of workplaces and for farmers, artists, and shepherds. Thanks to these spaces, the economy and commerce of the Sumerians obtained a significant growth. As a consequence, distant connections could be established with Anatolia, the Iranian plateau, and later with other regions located in the Persian Gulf. By all this evidence, we can state that the people of Sumer could be responsible for creating more complex societies. Because they were determined to trade with more distant towns and cities, furthermore, thanks to these improvements in transport routes, they were able to establish international relations with other regions.
The third approach is the military approach. Warfare in the Sumerian civilization was widespread, internally and externally. It was usual that walls surrounded the cities in order to protect the city from external attacks. In Sumer, there was no army. When the authorities decided the need for war, they called the free male citizens to arms, although professional soldiers existed. Military conflicts were mainly based on conquering other lands and avoiding being conquered, since one of the main focuses was to establish their kingdom as a sovereign. This is the case of Sumer and Elam, two societies whose relations were based on warfare. The war between Sumer and Elam took place around the year 2700 before the Common Era, since the Sumerians wanted to extend their territory so they could have the Elamites' resources under their control. The conflict perhaps took place when King Gilgamesh of Uruk needed cedar for the construction of a temple. These were independent societies that shared a border and created a conflict that pushed them into war that resulted in the defeat of the Elamites. Sumer's victories and conquests were due largely to their superiority on military weapons, tactics, organizations, and leadership. Because of their military superiority, their rivals were forced to improve their tactics, and this led to a new improvement of the Sumerian warfare tactics. Warfare made societies improve and develop in different ways because of the high interaction among them. Many objects have been found about Mesopotamian warfare. An example of this is the Stele of Pulturs. It is the first historiographical document, and it commemorates the victory of the Sumerian city-state of Lagash over its neighbor Umma, around the year 2450 before the Common Era.
Kramer defines the Sumerian culture as the dominant cultural group of the entire Near East. There were several social and cultural abilities that highlighted the relations between the 12 city-states and the influence on foreign civilizations. The city was organized into a religious and agricultural society, and therefore the architecture was too. Its Sumerian city-state had one god patron by which all the religious monuments and temples were inspired. Most of the temples had this typical tower named ziggurat, which lately inspired the Egyptian pyramids. It was an essential architectural structure for Sumer cities in which human god leaders resided. Sumerians were the first on developing cuneiform scripts in clapboards, composed by geometric figures, which also made mathematics begin to be born. Cuneiform script caused an improvement on communication for trade between their cities and enabled future generations to continue the use of their language. Concerning literature, Sumerian city-states inspired ancient civilizations such as Greeks and Egyptians. For instance, their forms of literature could be seen in myths and legends that are still popular today, such as the giants or the creation of man myths. With this statement by Lisa Marder, we can see how artists needed to import materials in order to complete their works and sculptures, making it an incredible advance for trade. There were Sumerian influences on Egyptian temples and pottery art. We can see one example with the spouted jars. However, we could also find Egyptian effects on Sumerian royal iconography, animal concerts, and pyramids. Here are also some examples. Once again, we can prove that Sumerian cultural exchanges between different societies have spread out international relations.
To conclude our script, we reiterate on our thesis. The Sumerians were clear pioneers of what is known as international relations. They established complex societies with the first functional and well-structured government and one of its first democracies. Also, they went farther in economic relations. They did not resign themselves to trade with each other, but however, in order to trade with more distant cities, they devoted time and labor to improve the means of transportation. Another fact by which we think that Sumerians initiated international relations is based on warfare. Disputes in the civilization were recurrent, although it was through war different civilizations were in contact and communicated with each other. Finally, cultural awareness allowed Sumer people to bring together and share their customs while also expanding it to outside their borders. This gives us to understand that already at that time there was enough communication for a civilization alien to the Sumerians to adopt these contributions and improvements.